I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker. He's the local MP, Kelvin Hopkins. I was meant to say Kelvin Mackenzie there. That would have been horrible. They might share the same first name, but trust me, that is all they share. Everyone, please, for MP Kelvin Hopkins. Woo!
Thank you very much. It's not the first time that mistake's been made, I assure you. It frequently introduces Kelvin Mackenzie, but there's a slight difference in politics. Anyway, the first thing I should do is to read out a message from Gavin Shuker, who's my friend and comrade and fellow MP for Luton South. He couldn't be here because he's taken a short holiday, the first proper holiday he's had, I think, this year, and he's abroad for a week, but he wanted this message to be read out. I'm sorry I can't be here to join you all this evening, but I wanted to send you my wholehearted support for today's rally. You're all here because we know that this government has a choice. And what have they chosen? They've chosen to stunt economic growth, cut vital public services and remove the safety net for the most vulnerable in our country. Just look at Luton. We have seen this Tory-led government force local authorities to carry out their dirty work for them. This council's budget has been slashed by a staggering £48 million, and Mr Osborne is telling us that there is no option but to continue to cut deeper. £48 million, a sum which strips our local authorities' services back so far that by 2015, Luton's council will not even have the money to cover the cost of basic statutory services. We already have 1 in 4 households in Luton sitting in the poverty bracket. Drastic cuts to benefits mean that almost half of Luton's households will be in poverty by 2015. And only last week, Cameron said there will be more to come. In unemployment, we see long-term youth unemployment increasing by a shocking 1,000% in the last year. What hope is this government giving to the people of Luton come 2015? And while the likes of Osborne and Cameron snatch crucial services and opportunities from the young, the old, the vulnerable, they give 6,000 of the country's richest a tax break. How can they get away with it? This is why you're all here, because we can't let them get away with this any longer. We need this voice against the government. We need the TUC and trade unions to stand side by side with us, with the local community, with those who are already feeling the pain of these cuts, and for those who fear that pain in coming years. And we need to know that this trail of destruction which the government is choosing to leave in its path is not the only route for the people of Luton and across the country. We must stand up and say no. I shall report your applause back to Gavin, but it's a great pleasure to, I may say, work with Gavin, as a good comrade. Not here just as a Labour MP. I was actually a trade unionist for many years. I spent 23 years of my life working in the trade union movement, 17 of those with Nalgo Unison and 5 years at the TUC. So I'm in a sense a trade unionist who found his way into Parliament. And I think that solidarity between trade union movement and our politicians is absolutely vital. But as opposed to the cuts agenda, I said no from the beginning. I'm one of those people that the Tories call deficit deniers. As those sort of something like the Holocaust. It's outrageous what they call it. But yes, I am a deficit denier. The cuts programme is absolutely and wholly wrong. I said so from the beginning, quoting not just me, but Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said from the beginning that the government was going in precisely the wrong direction. And I keep on using that phrase over and over again, and I've not heard the Tories or anybody come back to me and say that I'm mistaken in my view. But where are we now? I think last week I went to the annual general meeting of the Citizens Advice Bureau in Luton, and the national chief executive, came down to speak to us. And he gave us some statistics about cuts, and these are those. He said that so far we've had 73% of the tax rises, so we've had 3/4 of the tax rises. We've only had 34% of investment cuts, so the investment cuts will be 3 times as big as they are. We've had 12% of benefit cuts, so the benefit cuts are still to come and will be 8 times bigger than those we've had so far. And for public services, we've had 6% of the cuts so far, and that means we're going to have 16 times as many cuts as we've had now. This is an appalling prospect for us all, and just shows how insane and cruel the government is. I have to say that I've had advice. My advice surgeries, already people coming to me with benefits problems, particularly those who suffer from disabilities. Disability benefits claimants are now being rechecked by a dreadful company called Atos, who have supposed doctors that are come along and examine these people. Atos, cynically, actually sponsored the Paralympics recently, and the athletes chose to hide their logos because they know what Atos is really like. And this is just the most extreme case I've had, where a man who was in hospital, one of my constituents, he was in hospital, he was suffering from cancer and heart disease, he was incapable of getting out of bed, and clearly his life expectancy was not long. Well, the Atos doctor said he was fit for work. It's unbelievable. He just told lies. I mean, when they got the form back, instead of saying, "Can you walk?" No, he'd put yes, and so on. It was just appalling. So they tell lies and take their money in an utterly cynical way. In local government, of course, we've heard from Gavin's statement that in a few years' time, not so long, Luton Borough Council won't have enough funding to be able to support their statutory services. The Tories clearly hate local government, and they always have done, I think, ever since Ken used to, with the GLC, when he was leader of the GLC, County Hall, which is opposite Parliament, he had a big neon sign up, and he used to put the unemployment figures ticking upwards all the time, and upset Mrs Thatcher. Well, you know, she should have done something about it. But anyway, she got so upset she abolished the GLC, and Ken had to then find another way back to politics. But you know, and the metropolitan counties, of course, were abolished because they were all Labour-controlled and doing very fine things. But they've all suffered from savage cuts in funding. But we have to make sure that the voters, the electorate, our people our citizenry know that the cuts are not being done willingly by local authorities, by the councils. They've been forced on them by this vicious Tory government. And I think that's very important to get that message over. Already we're seeing people attacking councils. And we're not going to say that councils don't make mistakes, but they are not the instigators of the cuts. It's the Tories and indeed the Lib Dems. But cuts are leading to unemployment, to poverty, inequality, an explosive mixture. And we've already seen what austerity is doing in some other countries. In Greece, the supposed Labour Party, PASOK, has become a supporter of austerity and cuts, and it is now a joke as a party. It's just an add-on to their Conservative Party. We mustn't let the parties of the left across Europe, including the Labour Party, follow that route, and indeed we're fighting against the cuts, I think, now. But they're not just cruel, unfair and vicious, these cuts, they're actually utterly wrong in economic terms as well. They're driven by ideology, and the ideology of a man called Friedrich von Hayek, who believed that the modern welfare state, full employment, state involvement in the economy was completely wrong. And he wrote a famous book, an infamous book called The Road to Serfdom. He believed that having a national health service, full employment, a welfare state and nationalised railways was somehow leading us to serfdom. And actually, of course, all of that gives empowered working class people. When you have full employment, you have negotiating power. When your living standards are rising and we have trade union rights, it's empowering working class people, not leading them on the road to serfdom. But nevertheless, Hayek, madman though he was followed by Friedman, and then followed by the Selsdon Tories, and ultimately Mrs Thatcher. Sadly, some people in New Labour followed that same ideology. I'm glad to say they're on the retreat now, and the real Labour Party is I think, re-establishing itself. It's a difficult process, and some of us have been fighting that for a long, long time, but we are now starting to make progress to pull us back to being a genuine socialist party. But we've seen privatisations and cuts in taxes on the rich and squeezed public services, but we've got to reverse all that. In 1997, just to show how bad the things were, in 1997, the National Health Service, when even New Labour was saying it wasn't a question of underfunding, it was all about culture, the National Health Service in Britain in health as a total, we were spending 3% less of our GDP on health than the French. With 3% of GDP less, doesn't sound very much, but it's the equivalent of £50 million per constituency. I went to see a man leading a delegation from Unison called Alan Milburn. He was the Secretary of State for Health at the time. And I said, I told him this story about underfunding of the health service, and I said, well, I want my £50 million for Luton North now, please. And he lost his temper with me, I may say. But the other said, so I'd given him a hard time, but he deserved it. Fortunately, the policy changed a little while later, and funding did rise dramatically later on. But now we have Cameron, Osborne and Clegg, and what they're obviously doing is they're exercising a scorched earth policy. They probably feel that they're not going to win the next election. So they want to kill off as much of the state as they possibly can before that time. They're making a pretty good job of it. I think it's demonstrations, it's the trade union movement, it's going to be industrial action that will actually stop them, and I think that's what tonight's meeting is about. But the economics of the argument are complete nonsense. I say the deficit is not even a problem. It's not the problem, it's not even a problem. The deficit is actually relatively small compared with what's been in the past. And when we've had deficits in the past, governments have made similar mistakes. In the 1920s, we had the so-called Geddes Acts. After the First World War, there was obviously after wars, there's always a big debt, a big government debt. So they squeezed public spending, and throughout the 20s you saw unemployment, you saw poverty, and at the end of the 1920s, the debt was bigger than it had been at the beginning, because people don't pay taxes when they're unemployed, and they have to be sustained by some kind of benefit at that time. After the 1930s, of course, we all know about, we had savage cuts across the world, led by Herbert Hoover in America, which drove the Great Depression, the Hungry 30s, the soup kitchens, the bread lines, all of that, which led on to indirectly the Second World War, and I think also led on to the victory of socialist governments across parts of the world. But that was another lesson in what not to do. But in 1945, the Labour government at that time refused. There was a big debt, of course, after the war. They refused to cut. They actually spent money. They built the National Health Service. They maintained full employment. They built the welfare state. They nationalised the railways and whatever. And what happened? There's a little graph here. Some of you can see it. It's taken from a TUC document. That big curve there, that's what happened to the debt as a result of Labour's policies after the Second World War. They dropped like a stone. So by the 1980s, it was back to the lowest levels we've seen in our history, in fact, and that's where we are now, just slightly above that low level. So compared with the Second World War, our deficit as of nothing. It is just a lie to say the deficit is a problem. What the problem is unemployment. What we need to do is target additional spending on areas of labour intensity, where you can soak up unemployment. These areas are, of course, the public services and the construction sector, precisely the areas that the Tories have been cutting. If we actually turn round those cuts, reverse those cuts, and spend more in those areas, unemployment would come down, more people pay taxes, and less people claiming benefits, and the deficit will come down just as it did after 1945. So the government is completely wrong. What they are doing is actually trying to destroy the world that we created after the Second World War, a world of empowered workers, of full employment, of a decent welfare state. That's what the Tories are trying to do. They want to drive us back to a world where we know our place, where we touch our forelocks. The world of Downton Abbey, no doubt. And don't believe Downton Abbey. Some of you may have seen the other programme about how servants were treated in the 1910s. It wasn't quite like Downton Abbey, I assure you. When they became ill, they were thrown out on the street or into the workhouse. We don't want to go back to that kind of world, but that's where the Tories are driving us if we don't act now. So I'm here to support the campaign, to support the demonstration, and hope every one of you will be on there on October the 20th. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kelvin Hopkins. I think the